Today we're going to cover Chapter 11 on portable fire extinguishers. Should be pretty easy peasy for you because the extinguishers are very similar to all of the fire protection systems that we've talked about so far. So let's get going on it. So why are extinguishers such a great little tool? Well, they're valuable tools because they're portable, and almost everybody except for a child or somebody who's handicapped or weaker, not able to pick it up, almost everybody can use one. They're very easy to use. They're inexpensive, therefore they can be placed throughout the buildings, hung, ready to be used. Usually they're within 75 feet of you, spaced at 150 feet. Depends on the situation. But yeah, they're all over a building and they're really easy to use. They can be placed when placed properly on a fire, and especially in the incipient stage, it can put out the fire before it gets out of control. So they're really valuable. Knowledge of extinguishers, though, and their suppression agents makes sure that we have the proper selection and we use them correctly. So a basic fire extinguisher, they almost all have the same parts. We'll see some exceptions. They'll have the cylinder itself where the product is. They'll have a nozzle or a horn that where the product goes out of the cylinder. They have a carrying handle, which also doubles as the mechanism. They'll have a locking mechanism, which is oftentimes just a pin, and then the handle is also has the trigger, and then a pressure gauge. Not all of them have a pressure gauge, but almost all of them have all the other parts. So how do we know where and when and how to place them? Well, the code tells us to. Code tells us what to do, and of course the standards are going to tell us how to do it. But pretty much the code is pretty clear on extinguishers, where to put them and what kinds. The International Building Code and Fire Code and our California version have the installation requirements, and then NFPA 10 gives us the installation, maintenance, and testing requirements, and they're the standard. So the NFPA 10 is our standard, and then in Chapter 10 we have, in Chapter 9 of the Fire Code and Building Code, we have our installation requirements. Now, as we've seen in talking about the different kinds of products we're going to use to put out different kinds of fires, our extinguishers are rated by the kind of fire that they're good for. So Class A, ordinary combustibles. Class B are flammable liquids and gases. Class C involves anything that's energized electrical equipment. Class D are combustible metals. And K, of course, our newer class, been around since about the 1990s or early 2000s, for kitchen fires, for the different kinds of cooking media and oils and fats that are highly combustible and operate at high temperatures. So like our different fire protection systems that we've talked about so far, we're going to use about 7 different products that are good for fighting fire. And of course, first of all, water is extremely good on Class A. So this little chart is in your book, Table 11.1, and it's a really good little chart showing, okay, depending on what kind of fire it is, what kind of product is best for it. We'll talk about each one. So it's going to use the same lettering system to classify the extinguishers as we use to classify the fires. So if you have a Class A fire, you want to use a Class A extinguisher or an ABC. If you have a C fire and you have an extinguisher that's only labeled for A, that's probably just water in there. Put water on energized electrical equipment, you're just going to make the situation worse. Okay, so some extinguishers we'll see that are A, AB, ABC, and BC. So it depends. It depends on the product they're using and what they're intended for. So, they on the sides of the extinguishers, they're going to tell you what they're good for, and they use the symbols like we see here on the left and pictograms like we see on the right. That's more of an international type of thing. So, getting back to the agents, water, of course, is going to be great for Class A fires. We don't want to use it, though, on Bs, Cs, Ds. All of those situations, they make it worse. And K. So don't use water on anything except for Class A fires. Now, I used to have one of these cool Class A water extinguishers, and it was awesome. I don't know why I sold it. I had 2 of them in my garage, and I sold them in a garage sale because I wanted to make more space in my garage. And now I deeply regret it, because you know what they're great for? Water fights. You fill them up to the level where they're supposed to be filled up with water. Then you put the lid back on. You take a pressure, like a compressor, and you shoot up the pressure gauge to the maximum that it's supposed to go. And then, baby, that thing will shoot across the street. We used to take them with us to Hume Lake and fill them up and drive around the streets and squirt people when we'd drive by. It was fun. But, I sold it. Oh, well. Of course, with Class A and B fires, if you use the right product, you have to use Class A foam for Class A fires, Class B foam for Class B fires. But foam is another great product. Creates a vapor barrier, thus suffocating the fire. There's 2 basic types, AFFF and FFFP. Not as effective if flammable liquid fires are under pressure or if they're cooking grease fires. And that's why we don't use foam or dry chem anymore on K fires. They're just not good on the cooking grease fires. So, the foam mixes with water, so it's not good in freezing temperatures. Here's a typical foam extinguisher. And it'll usually say on it foam and what kinds of class fires it's good for. Carbon dioxide is great for B and C fires, especially for C because it suffocates the fire. It takes away the oxygen, but also for B. Now, it's got a liquid, just like this carbon dioxide that we talked about earlier. Then when it's released, and, it's under pressure. The carbon dioxide's under pressure in there, so it wants to come out. As soon as you pull that trigger, it comes out. In fact, we use carbon dioxide sometimes for some of the other kinds of extinguishers, and I'll explain that later. There's no pressure gauges because it's just weighed. And the tare weight is the weight that it is when it's full. So that'll be stamped on the side of the cylinder, and if you weigh it and it's below, it needs to be refilled. So, of course, like I said, it suffocates the fire, and it needs to be used at a close range. You need to get right up close to the fire. I have seen these used on human beings. Now, again, asphyxiation is an issue, but if you're outside, and there's plenty of air and oxygen around, it's not going to be an issue. Where I've seen them used a lot is in special effects, where when they set a person on fire with gels and stuff like that, the person who's, acting like they're on fire and running and everything, well, they'll always have like a signal that when they're getting too hot or when they need them to come in and put them out, they'll have this signal because they're supposed to be screaming and flailing their arms, so that's not the signal. But usually it'll be like they tap themselves in a certain place or tap their head or whatever. And then they come in, and it's usually with CO2 that they use on them because it is both a flammable liquid and there's clothing that they put the liquid on top of. So it's both A and B, but it's mostly for the B part of the fire. Okay, enough about that. Here's your typical CO2. Notice that with CO2, one of the ways to tell a CO2 extinguisher, even from far away, is they'll have this much bigger horn instead of a little tiny nozzle. It's meant to disperse the gas better, so you'll see that kind of a horn on it. Dry chem, probably the most common fire extinguisher out there. Most businesses have dry chem extinguishers, and it's just small particles that are shot out, and it smothers the material. And they're technically not dangerous or toxic, but again, it's a powder, and you breathe that into your lungs. It's not good for you. So you don't want to spray that on a person unless they're on fire, and they're going to get severely burned if you don't. But it can cause respiratory problems. They're usually one of these kind of products, sodium bicarbonate or potassium. Each company has their own recipe, like we talked about before. And here's a guy who's using the pass method that we're going to talk about in a little bit, using a dry chem extinguisher on a flammable liquids fire in a container. And this is typical for training, that they use these kind of little trays, and they put a little bit of heptane or something like that in it and light it on fire, and then the person puts it out by using a dry chem extinguisher. This is very typical for extinguisher training. And you see there on the right-hand side a typical Class ABC dry chem extinguisher. You see them everywhere. They're all over the place. Most businesses use ABC dry chem. Wet chem, well, that's for those Class K fires. Kitchen fires where we have a water-based solution with potassium carbonate and all these other different products in it. But this reacts with the fat in the cooking medium, like the French fryer and the French fries fryer. And what it does is it mixes with the oil, the hot oil, and it creates a soapy blanket that smothers the fire. They call that process saponification, and that's just a fancy word for soapy, messy stuff that smothers the fire. So, but that's a great word to remember. You can use that in some trivia game. Do you know what saponification is? Yeah, liquid in agents that cool the cooking media and mix with it and create this foam blanket. That's saponification. Here's two typical K extinguishers. Now, I mentioned earlier that they're usually lightweight. Well, not these guys. This is a wet chemical inside that the first time I picked up a K extinguisher, it totally shocked me. I expected a certain weight, and I almost dropped it. It was like I went to just pick it up thinking it was light, and it was really heavy. So if you work in a kitchen, ask your chef or your manager of the restaurant if it's okay if you just picked up the K extinguisher. Try it out. They're heavier than you would expect just looking at them. But this is what they usually look like, and they have a green label on them. That's one of the ways to tell that it's K. And then we got the common extinguishing agents, or dry powders. And they are for our Class D combustible metal fires. So there's no one powder for every kind of Class D material. So these are going to be in places where they manufacture metals, where they work with lathes or metal plating, and all of these kind of places where they have a lot of combustible metals. And they're going to have the powder that's specific for their products. Usually, these kind of places don't get big fires, though many of you might have seen the big fire that LA Fire Department had at a metal plating plant. But, usually they have these powders that are right near where they're working. So if a little fire starts, they throw it on there, and boom, the fire's out. Or they use the extinguisher with the Class D material in there, and boom, they put it out while it's just catching fire. So it's pretty rare that they get away from them unless they don't have their extinguishers. So they've got to have the right agent at these factories where they work with the Class D kind of metals. And then lastly, we have the halon or clean agent, inert agent types of extinguishers. Now, I've seen these. I've seen one used, and from across the room, this guy just took like 2 or 3 squirts, and boom, this fire was out literally across the room from where he was. So these clean agents, inert agents, are more effective and more environmentally friendly than the old halon. Halon is basically being phased out because of they believe it's doing damage to the ozone, and so those halocarbon-based agents are going away, and the inert gases or the clean agents, those are more the new wave to be used with, as we saw before, computers and electronics. So they rate them, and they give them a number rating. Of course, you have the class, that's the letter A, B, C, D, K, and then the numbers are usually have to do with how effective it is. You can look in the book and see some of the charts that go with this, but it explains how they rate them. The A and B have number ratings, so like you'll have a 1A, 10 BC type dry chem extinguisher, or a 2A, 10 BC. That's a very common one. And it basically is saying how much fire the extinguisher can handle. So if you have a bigger facility or bigger hazards, you might have a 40 BC, 10A 40 BC, or a 2A, whatever. So these numbers have to do with what they can put out. They're tested and rated like this. So with the Class A extinguishers, they use it on a wood crib, and I'll show you a picture of that in the next one. And the Class B are tested in a flammable liquid fire in a pan like we saw in the photo a couple of minutes ago. The flammable liquid is usually heptane, and the Class C extinguishers, they don't receive a rating. And I'll explain that to you in a second. So this is typical wood cribbing that they would use when they're testing how effective a Class A extinguisher is. The Class C extinguishers, what they're concerned about is how conductive is the material. If it's conductive at all, it can't be rated C. If it's not conductive, then fine. So no conductivity to protect against arcing and shock and all of those kind of things. So they have these tests that they do. They'll spray the product to see if it conducts electricity. So that was the classes of fire and the different kinds of agents. And now we're going to talk about the different types of fire extinguishers. Classes of fire extinguishers that correlate to the class of fire. I kind of said that wrong earlier. The types of fire extinguisher has to do with how they work. So there's pump extinguishers out there. They're not as common anymore. There used to be a lot of pump extinguishers in the early days before they figured out better ways to make them work. But wildland firefighters use pump extinguishers like this 5-gallon backpack type extinguisher that might have a mixture of water and Class A foam, or it might just be straight water. So these work with a pumping mechanism that's similar to a bicycle pump. And some of them are used like in a backpack type situation here, or some of them are a typical container where you just hold the container and you have to pump it. Not as common. Most of them are stored pressure extinguishers. That's probably what you're going to see more than anything out there. And these are the AB, the ABC type extinguishers. And they have either air or some kind of a pressurized gas that is mixed with the agent in the tank. So a stored pressure extinguisher has the product that's going to put it out and a propellant in it, whether it's air, under pressure or a gas. Now, the way we know if they are ready to go is by the pressure gauge on it. And we always want to check the pressure gauge, make sure it has adequate pressure. Here's 3 different stored pressure extinguishers. And again, every single one, you know it's stored pressure extinguisher because it has a pressure gauge on it. Okay? So the next type is cartridge pressure extinguishers. They're very similar except for the agent and the expellant are not in the same cylinder. They're in different cylinders. So in the example that you can see to the right there, this is probably got a powder or a wet chem kind of product or a foam product in it that is not going to come out on its own. It needs something to push it out. So they put a CO2 cartridge next to it, or some type of gas cartridge, but usually CO2 because it also works to help put out the fire. There's not going to be a pressure gauge. You can remove the top and put the agent in and then screw it on, take it on and off because it's not under pressure. With a stored pressure, if you're going to change the product or add any to it, you've got to release all of the pressure because if you open the top, it's going to explode on you. So you don't want to do that. And here's a typical one of the cartridges. It's a big, like for those of you who do paintball, it's like a very big version of those little CO2 cartridges you use on your paintball guns. So, and then you can see the extinguisher on the right. Now, there's some obsolete types of fire extinguishers out there. Very rare to run across them anymore, still being used because most of them don't work anymore. They have corrosive products or conductive products, and they've been banned from being used. Now, where you do see them, I've got one here in my house that somebody cut the top off of it, and it's copper, and it's really cool looking with lettering on it, and we use it for an umbrella holder and cane holder. So, yeah, that's about all they're good for. Some people make them into lamps or put them out in their backyard or whatever. It's decorative. Don't use them anymore. Soda acid, the carbon dioxide extinguishers with the metal horn because the metal was conductive, all of those have been eliminated. Well, how do we use them? Well, most people with little or no training can use an extinguisher. You pull the pin and you squeeze it. But we try and teach people to use the pass method. And most of the time, those instructions are going to be on the side of the extinguisher. The pass method is pull the pin, aim the nozzle, squeeze the handle, sweep at the base of the fire. Pull, aim, squeeze, sweep. So everyone should be aware of where their extinguishers are, where they work. You should notice that if you've never had it pointed out to you, but remember where they are because you might need them someday. Now, all extinguishers have to go through testing and maintenance and consistently be visually inspected as well as tested and maintained. All of these are in NFPA 10, but also the State Fire Marshal has rules on how often they have to be inspected. So if you look at every extinguisher, they're going to have a tag on the side which tells you when they were last maintained, and you're supposed to sign it when you visually inspect it, and the State Fire Marshal certified maintenance company signs it and dates it when they do maintenance, and they'll usually change the tag when they do that. So the inspectors must be trained and certified, and only certain companies are certified to maintain them. So a visual inspection, they just want to make sure that it's there, that it is, if it's a stored pressure, that the pressure gauge is in the right place. It's supposed to be done once a month, just making sure it's there, it's visible, it's accessible, it's hung correctly, the tag is still there, that it's not physically damaged, and there's pressure in it. When you do a visual inspection, you also Some functions are now performed through electronic monitoring system. Fire alarm system or a monitoring panel, I've never seen one of these, but they're out there. The maintenance has to be done per the manufacturer's requirements and per the state fire marshal's requirements, which is usually annually. So they're going to, sometimes they take all the product out, sometimes they don't. It just depends on what the requirements are. Inspectors, when we are inspecting buildings, we want to go out and make sure that they're tagged and that they have been getting their regular maintenance. Because a lot of times businesses trying to save money, they don't want to do that maintenance, and they postpone. And so we got to make sure that they do it. It has to be done by trained personnel. Now, every 5 to 12 years, depending on the extinguisher, they also need to be hydrostatically tested. Okay, that was 26 minutes long. We're done. Make sure that you take the little pop quiz having to do with fire extinguishers. Have a great day.